learned that my back button does not work when I'm in the middle of presenting. So, and I just have this as bullet points. Typically, I have everything kind of written out. So if we start a video, and I don't mean to yet, we just got to finish it. So there's a very high chance that that's what happened. So, but so I think it's been 2 weeks since we picked up from the last one. But we talked about the Holocaust. In Daniel 12 talks about the time of trouble such as never was. There's Jeremiah 16 and Jeremiah 33 that talk about this time of Jacob's trouble and this terrible thing that would occur to the Jews that would result in the rebirth of Israel and the regathering of the Jews. But it was specifically designed to also be a double recompense. So there would be a time of double recompense or punishment that would lead to the rebirth of Israel and the regathering of the Jews. And that, as we talked about last time, was the Holocaust. And we finished last with 2 videos that kind of summed up some of the things we had talked about, things going on in the 1930s and early 40s. Now we're gonna start with a 3rd video. That this is going to kind of recap the situation in Palestine, again from the 30s to the 40s. You're going to see the importance of the Holocaust in all these things. So if there was no Holocaust, there would not have been a nation of Israel. There just would not have been, and you'll see that from this. And I want you also to pay attention to Britain's motives and their desire for peace with the Arabs and how that kind of influenced all of these things. So I'm going to press a button here, and I hope a video starts.
In the 1930s, Palestinians took up arms against a colonial government that they believed was robbing them of the prospect of independence in their own country.
These pictures from Patty's own cameraman in the East show the height of the danger in Jerusalem when arson, murder and wanton destruction were making the Holy Land a land of terror. But behind the outward peace lies still the threat of rebellion and disorder. Britain still stands by.
The British responded ruthlessly, but it took them 3 years to crush the uprising. Palestinian leaders were exiled, their movement disarmed. Hitler's defeat in the Second World War revealed the unbelievable. Auschwitz and the annihilation by the Nazis of some 25 million people. 6 million were Jews. The Holocaust was to break the back of Britain's Palestine policy. It won the Jews worldwide sympathy and the Zionists support in their demand for a Jewish state.
They can smile now, these people who a few short weeks ago thought they would never smile again. Then the entire camp is scorched off the face of the earth by British flamethrowers. The fires blot out the place, but not the memory.
Well, I was in Auschwitz when I realized that the only solution, or rather the only hope of survival for the Jews, for us Jews, would be a state of our own, a country where we could live and work, a country that could protect us. Of course, I didn't really believe that I would survive Auschwitz. But should I survive, I decided I would be a very dedicated Zionist.
From Britain and America, the Holocaust refugees got sympathy, but no offers of sanctuary. Undismayed, the Zionists called for them to be admitted to Palestine. They saw immigration as the key to a Jewish state, though they needed the new British Labour government to unlock the door. For Prime Minister Clement Attlee and his Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin, the request posed a dilemma. Jewish immigration to Palestine had been restricted before the war, and they were reluctant to lift the quotas.
Bevin's view was that one of the reasons we had fought the war was Nazi anti-Semitism. And one of the consequences of the war ought to be the possibility of Jews living normal lives in Europe again. he said this in public several times. Why now that Nazism has been destroyed, should the Jews not again contribute to the cultural and economic life of Europe as they did before?
Bevan suggested after World War II that the Jews should not worry so much about Palestine. We should help to rebuild Europe on the smoking ruins of our families. That's what he suggested. That was the humanity which was shown to us by Mr. Bevan.
Of course, Ernie Bevan saw very clearly that if you were to have Palestine flooded by Jews, whatever the humanitarian reasons, this was going to cause immense trouble, not only with the Arabs of Palestine, but also with the whole Islamic world and the Arab countries, with whom he also wanted to establish a new relationship which would not be the old relationship of protectorates and empire and all the rest of it.
The Arab rulers of the Middle East were now seen as pillars of the empire. British oil supplies, strategic routes, bases like Palestine, and defense against communism all depended on good relations with the Arab states. But the Arab League were vocal opponents of Jewish immigration to Palestine. They feared the Zionists' intentions, as did the Palestinians.
Difficult things to see, for sure. But, like I said, emphasis on the fact that it is a Holocaust that broke the back of Britain's policy here. Another important thing, I think, is when you hear about a lot of these different things, you see the Arabs in Palestine, they say, why do they have to come here? They could have gone anywhere else. Why did they have to come here and take what they saw as their country? But as you saw, the two greatest powers, Britain and the U.S., they sympathized with the Jews, but they weren't going to let any come in. And that's the state that every single nation had. They sympathized, but they also said, we don't want you. So there was literally nowhere for them to go. Very important. Now, obviously, Britain resisted Jewish immigration to their mandate in Palestine. But all these different nations, particularly the United States, as we'll see in a minute, kept putting pressure on Britain to let the Jews in. But Britain, for very selfish reasons, wanted to keep it, so they resisted this pressure as long as possible. But really, they wanted control of... It's not working here. They wanted control of the land because they wanted the control of the oil that was passing through it. So it's kind of funny, the same interests that caused Britain to seek to acquire Palestine, those same interests kicked them out as well. So, and that's basically national foreign policy. It doesn't matter what the end result is this is what's beneficial to our nation. So whatever we got to do, even if it causes us to kind of reverse our stance on certain things, like they were pro-Jewish because that let them get the land, but then they turned anti-Jewish because the Jews needed them out. That's how things work. But God, set all these things up to where they could not stay. There were so many things going on that God was forcing them out, and the Holocaust was one of the greatest means of that. We won't talk about it much, but it's also interesting. I didn't know this. The French were a huge influence in getting Britain out of there because the French were supporting the Jewish Haganah and all the other forces. Britain and France were huge rivals. When they were dividing up the Ottoman territory, France wanted Britain's help with certain things, but Britain wouldn't give it. So this was kind of France's way of getting back at Britain. They said, okay, you helped our enemies when they were fighting us. Now we're going to help yours. And those were the Jews. So you kind of saw the entire world condemned Britain for their treatment of the Jews. And this kind of pushed them, specifically Ernest Bevan, who was the foreign minister, I believe. He decided to seek the advice of the United Nations. And this was specifically to kind of spite the Jews. And you'll see in another video in a minute here. You're kind of thinking, well, you think we're bad. We're going to send you to the United Nations. They're going to treat you even worse. Ended up completely backfiring. So when they brought this issue up to the United Nations created a special committee just for this, and it was called UNSCOP, the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine. They just call it UNSCOP. So that was created in May of 1947. And I think in one of the previous talks, we talked about the Exodus ship. About 4,500 Holocaust survivors, many of them women, pregnant women, elderly, sick, wretched beings. You're going to get to see some of them here in a minute. But it just so happened that as the Exodus landed in Palestine, or in Haifa Harbor, and the British soldiers got on there and started beating and tear gassing the people, these two officials from UNSCOP, they were sent to Palestine to assess the situation, to pretty much determine, what do we need to do? Should there be partition? Should there not be partition? What needs to be done? This says here, this book's called I Am Cyrus. It says, as if God ordained that the eyes of the world be focused on this scene, and this is the Exodus coming into Haifa. UNSCOP chairman, Judge Emil Sandstrom, and committee member, doesn't matter, happened to be in Haifa that day with Aubrey Eban. They witnessed the entire tragic event, which became a public relations disaster for Great Britain. The situation became even more difficult when the mandatory government announced that instead of taking the refugees to Cyprus, they planned to take them back to Germany on prison ships. After watching the torrid scene, Sandstrom, which is again, he's the chief of this committee, he announced out loud, Britain must no longer have the mandate over Palestine. And that's super important because that was not even one of their options that they were supposed to go there to determine. It was, should they vote for partition? Should they not? Not should Britain have the mandate. But seeing the treatment, they said they don't even need this. Britain needs to get out. So you can kind of see the impeccable timing. I mean, they were touring Palestine all over the place. And for them to be at this place, to witness this one event, strange coincidence. So this is, I've got 3 videos. We might skip one of them, but this first video, this is about when Britain sought UN advice, and they'll kind of explain that. The second one is about when UNSCOP, when those 2 members came to the land, and you'll see the response, how the Jews reacted to the members coming and how the Arabs did. And you can see obviously why it worked in the Jews' favor. And then the third one will just kind of show the importance of UNSCOP.
At the end of 1946, Bevin went to America, knowing that many British cabinet ministers supported the Zionist plan for partition of Palestine. But in his talks with the Americans, he remained adamant that Britain would not risk antagonizing the Arabs. Bevin devised a new way out of the dilemma. Winning the cabinet over, he asked the United Nations to advise Britain on a solution.
We were ambivalent. On the one hand, we wanted to get out of Mr. Bevin's clutches. On the other hand, when he said, I'll put it to the United Nations, he said this in a rather threatening voice. You think I'm bad, all right, I'm going to suggest somebody who will hit you even harder, and you'll get nothing out of the UN at all.
And obviously backfired. Yeah, like I said, the second one's when those 2 members came to the land.
In June 1947, a special committee, known as UNSCOP, was sent on a fact-finding tour. To the Arabs, this was yet another inquiry dominated by America, which had no right to pronounce on their future. Palestinian leaders boycotted its hearings. In contrast, the Jewish agency set out to impress.
We appointed 2 liaison officers, Horowitz, who was later our leading economist and banker, and myself, to accompany the commission and, as it were, illuminate the whole Zionist picture from their point of view. And therefore, it was part of my job to see that they learnt as much about our point of view as possible.
The Zionist lesson was driven home by the legendary Exodus affair. It proved a powerful publicity coup.
With a cargo of 4,500 refugees, the Exodus is the largest ship ever to attempt to run the watchful British naval blockade. After a bloody battle with a British boarding party, the refugees disembark at Haifa. Some are dying. 20 others are in a serious condition. And as the tired and weary refugees are transferred to British prison ships, 2 members of the United Nations Committee on Palestine silently look on.
They actually went on board, some members of the UN Commission, and they saw the hose pipes and the tear gas being turned on these very wretched-looking people who had escaped from concentration camps in Germany. It was apparently such a squalid spectacle that the first thing that the UNSCOP decided was not partition or against partition, but the mandate has to end.
With the tide running against him, Bevin decided to make an example of the Exodus refugees. He sent them back where they had come from, to Germany and the refugee camps. For Bevin, it was a propaganda disaster.
I got one more here for you, and then we'll mosey on.
In May 1947, the United Nations set up a special committee on Palestine. It really was a turning point. Now, if that commission had not recommended Jewish statehood, we would have had no chance whatever of securing a resolution for a Jewish state in the General Assembly. It was very impressive that 11 men, who were by no means the central luminaries in their governments, none of whom had any experience in making drastic historic decisions, all came to the conclusion that the British mandate had to end. It invited the Arabs and the Jews each to appoint 2 liaison officers. The Arabs contemptuously refused to nominate their liaison officers. It was one of their greatest mistakes. Their refusal gave me and my colleague David Horowitz an open field. In diplomacy, one gains more by the folly of adversaries than from one's own wisdom. The most striking appeal to the United Nations Committee was made by Chaim Weizmann.
We realize that we cannot have the whole of Palestine. God may have promised Palestine to the Jews. It is up to the Almighty to keep his promise in his own time. Our business is to do what we can in a very imperfect human way.
As one of the Zionist liaison officers, my job was to encourage the UN committee to see our work and to understand our hopes. A ship of so-called illegal immigrants was brought into Haifa. I persuaded the chairman, Dr. Sundström of Sweden, and a colleague of his to witness the scene. The ship arrived in Haifa harbor with 4,000 refugees from the German slaughterhouse on board. They came with tragic memories and with a shining hope. They were met by British soldiers who arrested them, put them in cages on a British ship, and dragged them away screaming. The cages had a traumatic effect on the members of the UN committee. When they left Haifa, they came back pale and shocked. Now, that one incident made many people understand that if that's the only way that the British mandate could work, it had better not continue at all. Mr. Bevin ordered the ship back to Hamburg. The desperate passengers from Exodus were back where they had begun, at a refugee camp in Germany, where they could be watched from guard towers. It was as though the film of their lives was running backward.
Yeah, you can imagine just being one of those poor people, and you're liberated just to get sent right back to the same camps. But it had the effect that God desired it to have. So not long after that, Britain essentially gave up. They said on May 14th, 1948, we don't care what happens. We are going to pull out of Palestine. That is the end of our mandate. And that was actually in September that they declared that. September 47, May of the next year, they were going to be out. And basically, they were so sick and tired of being verbally abused for what they did they decided, well, the best course of action is to do nothing. So Arab aggression on Jews, they didn't really take care of it. Jewish aggression on Arabs, they didn't really do anything to stop it. It was very, very hands-off, and it led to escalation in the area. But in November of 47, the subject of partition came up in the UN. This was whether they should split the land that they called Palestine to allow a Jewish state and an Arab state. And this is essentially a vote determining whether the world is in favor of a new Jewish nation or not. And it doesn't create one by its vote, but it calls for one. So if it does vote in favor of partition, it's saying a Jewish state needs to be created. Now, Britain abstained from the vote. And it's amazing how you can see how sick and tired of the issue there was. There's a lot of paperwork and a lot of discussions and meetings that go on with this, obviously. The whole time, the only contribution Britain made was to a single comma in a committee report. A committee report. That's not even the final document, so you can tell the guy was just essentially sitting there existing as these things continued. But I think they used the term that they washed their hands. And there's the UN Hall, 1947, and by a vote of 33 to 13 with 10 abstentions, it passed. I mean, all around the world. You'll see a video on this in a minute. People they had their notepads and they were counting yes, no, because it was very, very close. But this is a momentous occasion because for nearly 2,000 years the Jews were exiled. They lost their language, and now the world votes in favor of creating a Jewish state. We won't turn to it, but in Daniel 12:7 talks about the 1260 days prophecy. There's a lot of different ways of looking at the different, the 1260, 1290, and 1335 days in Daniel 12. But it's interesting. If you look back 1260 years from this point, it brings you to, I think it's 587 AD, and that's the year they started the construction of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. So 1260 days forward from that, we have this release or pretty much a vote to create a Jewish state. And again, there's other thoughts on that, but I think it's very, very interesting. But as you look at this, I mean, it's not too different from when God brought Israel out of Egypt in the Exodus then. I mean, they were terribly oppressed, and then they were finally relieved after the oppression. So this, like I said, I got a video on this, and you'll just see the rejoicing and what this meant to the Jews.
The history of Israeli diplomacy is a history of cliffhangers. There's never been a case where our victory was assured. If we lost, we'd have been worse off than before. It's one thing not to have Jewish statehood confirmed, but to have Jewish statehood rejected is a much worse condition.
Afghanistan? No. Argentina? Abstention. Ethiopia? Abstain. France? Yes.
I am confident on the way you will behave in a so serious decision taken by this assembly, because I am decided not to allow anybody to interfere in our decisions.
South Africa? Yes. Soviet Union? Yes. United Kingdom? Abstain? Yes. United States? Venezuela? Yes. Yes. Yemen? No. Yugoslavia? Abstain.
The resolution of the DUC Committee for Palestine was adopted by 33 votes, 13 against, 10 abstentions.
6 months from now, in May 1948, the British mandate will end. And 50 years after Herzl, it will no longer be a dream.
over the land there. They just really didn't know how to express themselves. But as it said, 6 months from that date, Britain was leaving. So they had 6 months to figure out what they were going to do. And actually the UN throughout this period was trying to reach some sort of official agreement. So when it did expire, they had a plan involved. It ended up they weren't able to get something, but we'll get to that. And now we come to someone who I think if there's a one person who had the biggest influence on the rebirth of Israel, I'd say it is Harry S. Truman. Obviously there were many people involved, but the book called I'm Cyrus about Truman, there's a reason it's called that. I mean, just like Cyrus ordered the reconstruction of Jerusalem and the bringing back of the Jews, Truman had a very, very similar role. And it's incredible to trace just kind of his whole life and his relations with the Jews throughout all these different periods, because you very clearly see God's hand working with him. Now, he was a farmer from Independence, Missouri, the most unlikely person to be president. He never, ever wanted to be even vice president. He had failed at most everything he'd ever done in his life. But he went into World War I. He became a captain. They gave him like this super rambunctious group, and he ended up winning their respect and getting through the war without losing a single man. And he came out of the war a leader of men. And after the war, he started a haberdashery. And you can see like a bunch of shoes and men's ties, things like that. And I think it was Kansas City. And he did this with his World War I buddy, Eddie Jacobson. Now, Eddie Jacobson was a Jew. He wasn't a religious Jew. But Truman, growing up in Independence, that was still a rough-in town back then. Truman was not raised to like Jews, but with World War I, he really liked Eddie Jacobson. So they did this for a while. That's Truman there on the left. And this business actually ended up going under. They lost a ton of money. But Truman was a biblical fundamentalist, as the I Am Cyrus book says again. He constantly pointed to Old Testament passages to justify his positions on things. Having failed at everything else, he finally found his stride in politics. I think he started as a judge. But he kind of slowly worked his way up, and he became a senator from Missouri, and he was perfectly content. He's like, I never want to do anything more than this. But he eventually became the vice presidential candidate for FDR in 1944. He was so opposed to this that in order to get him to even run for vice president, FDR and these Democratic bosses, they pretty much set him up. They faked a phone call to where these Democratic bosses, they had Truman on the side like he wasn't supposed to be there. They called FDR, and FDR said, well, have you got Truman lined up yet? He said, no, he's just, he's fighting tooth and nail. And then FDR just said, well, if he wants to split up the Democratic Party, tell him that's on him. So Truman, seeing that, like, well, if that's what's at stake, I have no choice but to accept. The whole thing completely staged, but he eventually accepted it and became vice president. Issue was, this was FDR's fourth term. I mean, no other president has ever served that many terms. And he was very popular. I mean, he got the U.S. through the Great Depression, through much of World War II, and that was really his main thing. That's really the only thing he cared about, was winning the war. But he was actually in a wheelchair the whole time he was as a president. You never see him in pictures like that, but he had polio, I believe it was. And just 82 days into his fourth term, he died. And Truman immediately became president. Again, he didn't even want to be vice president, and he certainly didn't want to be president. And he says, when he learned that FDR died, I felt like the moon, the stars, and all the planets had fallen on me. David Niles, he's one who he worked extensively with FDR and with Truman. He says that, if Roosevelt had lived and Truman had not been president, there probably would not have been an Israel. Because FDR's position on the Jews kind of went back and forth. Again, really, the only thing he really cared about, he was sick, he was getting older, very weak. He just wanted to win the war. He was in favor for him, but probably would not have gone to the extent that Truman did. And the reason I say Truman is so important is, it wasn't the United States necessarily that supported the Jews, and in many cases it was, but it was the person Truman that made the state of Israel, not the United States. He actually had just an ongoing battle with the U.S. State Department, because the State Department was like Britain. There are more Arabs. Therefore, we need to please them and have more allies on our side. Truman went directly against them, and throughout his life, he just basically said, I want to do what I think is right. But Eddie Jacobson's influence comes in very heavily here. Because throughout Truman's presidency, you can imagine all these Zionists coming and lobbying him and talking to him. And some of them were very, very critical of him. And it got to the point where Truman said, I'm not talking to any other Zionists. I don't care. I'm so sick and tired of the issue. But the one person he would listen to was his buddy from World War I, Eddie Jacobson, a Jew. Now, it was coming up to a very critical moment for the Zionist cause, and they needed American support. So they sent Chaim Weizmann. You remember he would be the president of Israel later on. They sent him to the United States to talk to Truman, but Truman would not see him. But he would see Eddie Jacobson. So Eddie Jacobson came in. He convinced him to talk to Chaim Weizmann. And from that point on, Truman said, I am supporting the Jews. I will do whatever I need to do to help their cause. And you'll see a video on this in a second. But it's only because of Eddie Jacobson, this Jew's impact on him, that all these things happened.
In March 1948, prominent military strategists, including Field Marshal Montgomery, Secretary of State George Marshall, and Secretary of Defense Forrestal, were saying that the Jews would not be able to survive the imminent assault by the Arab regular armies.
I remember one time talking to James Forrestal, who was Secretary of Defense, and he said, Clark, you just don't understand this. It's a question of arithmetic. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, there are 45 million Arabs and 350,000 Jews. And the 45 million Arabs are going to push the 350,000 Jews right into the ocean. So he said, that's all there is to it.
Outside of the White House, Jewish supporters demonstrated. They feared that the United States was going to abandon partition and to support foreign rule under United Nations trusteeship. It was vital to get President Truman to hold fast to the partition scheme.
Dr. Sam Weitzman had been trying to get in all along, and I wouldn't let him in. But someone did come to see me, and he got in. This man with whom I was in business was Eddie Jacobson, one of the finest men I ever had anything to do with. He came in, he stood around, didn't say very much, was as quiet as he could be, and I finally said, Eddie, what in the world's the matter with you? Have you at last come to get something? Well, because you never have asked me for anything since I've been in the White House and since we've been friends. And then he told me that he thought that I ought not to keep Dr. Weitzman out of the White House. He thought I ought to see him. And I told him that I would see the doctor, but he'd have to bring him in at the side door. I didn't want any propaganda started on the thing. Dr. Weitzman's first name was C-H-A-I-M, and I didn't know how to pronounce it, so I called him Cham, called him that to his face, and he liked it. He was a wonderful man, one of the wisest people I think I ever met. We had a long, long conversation, and he explained the situation from his viewpoint, and I listened to him very carefully, and at the same time I sent for Eddie Jacobson, and they both sat down and talked to me for a long, long time. When we were through, I said, all right, you two Jews have put it over on me, and I'm glad you have.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, he was a very smart man, a very, very simple man as well. You just called him Cham. Yeah. Cham. Yeah, Chaim is how he technically said. But, so very important, I think, as a result of World War II, Britain was absolutely poor. I mean, so poor they had to get a loan from the United States. The bread rationing after the war was worse than any time during the war in Britain. So because they got this loan from the U.S., the U.S. had a very large hold on Britain, and you're going to see that in just a second. And this is where I say his personal influence directed the sequence of events here. So he had been pushing for, they had called for 100,000 Jews to be brought into Jerusalem, or in Palestine. Britain was saying no, but Truman, through his, personal power, changed it.
Onto that British vessel, Zionists are transferred from a small Jewish refugee ship to be deported to Cyprus, and some try to resist. So near to Zion, and now to be taken away. Removed from their tiny craft, they leave what has been an ordeal of evil conditions, unsanitary overcrowding and thirst. But to them, internment on Cyprus is just another exile, and they have to be forced.
Bevin wanted no more refugees in Palestine than the Arabs would agree to. But the Zionists demanded entry for 100,000 and had won the backing of the American president, Harry Truman. He controlled the aid that war-scarred Britain desperately needed.
I remember in Bevin's absence once, I had to receive the American ambassador. And he said he had a message from the president for the Secretary of State. The president wished to repeat his urgent and earnest request to admit immediately 100,000 Jewish refugees into Palestine. And I said that, according to my brief, I said that the Secretary of State's view was that this was simply a recipe for war. Well, the ambassador had expected this, and he simply said, very deliberately, the fact is that the president believes that if Mr. Bevin can accede to his request, that would help Britain's friends in Congress to get through the latest appropriation of British aid, which is how a diplomat says, I mean, there was bread rationing in Britain at that time. That's how a diplomat says, you do what we want or you'll go hungry.
And back here in Washington, domestic reflections of Palestine's days of crisis. President Truman meets with members of the Jewish war veterans, here to press demands for immediate admission of 100,000 refugees.
America had the largest Jewish community in the world. For Truman, their votes were vital. Influential Zionists had regular access to the White House, and some contributed generously to Truman's campaign funds.
President Truman's attitude toward Palestine was made up of mixed motives. He had been deeply horrified by the full scope of the Holocaust when we got into Eastern Europe and found out what that meant. He, of course, was heavily involved with Jewish people in the United States who were in support of Palestine from a political point of view.
Yeah, so, the first time he publicly supported the Jews was after Britain issued that 1939 white paper that pretty much said, we're limiting this. So 8 days after that, that's when he publicly supported them. Now, the United States, they had the largest population of the Jews in the entire world, actually. And like he mentioned there, that was obviously, there was a voting aspect for Truman as well. But when it came to partition and the United Nations vote, it was him, specifically him, that got the votes for it. I mean, he ordered people to go around and pretty much pull as many arms and do anything they got to do to get the votes necessary. And you can see he basically forced Britain to let the Jews in. Otherwise, well, you guys won't get your food and the stuff you need from us. And he actually went against the advice of General George Marshall, he was his pretty much Truman's idol. But again, like Britain, George Marshall said there's more Arabs, we need to please them. But Truman went against his advice to make this happen. So 6 months before the mandate would end, and again, the vote did not create a Jewish state. It voted to create one. But either way, Britain's going to be out in 6 months. So, like I said, in this period, the UN tried to come up with some agreement. That way it's a nice, smooth transition when Britain leaves. But Ben-Gurion David Ben-Gurion, he was, I forget his technical position in Palestine at the time, but he knew this meant war. War was coming, and it's going to be a bunch of conventional armies, Arab armies, against whatever the Jews had at the time, so he started preparing. They didn't have hardly any arms. They had basically $0, hardly any troops. I mean, really everything. They were completely shorthanded of. But this woman here, I'm sure you've heard of her, Golda Meir. She would later be a prime minister of Israel as well. She made this possible essentially. She went to the United States. She had $10 in her pocket when she arrived in the United States, and her job basically was to go and try to talk to all the Jewish factions in the United States to get funds to fight a war. I mean, as much as she could possibly get. As it says here, the woman who had arrived in the U.S. one bitter January night with $10 in her pocketbook would leave with $50 million. And that's 10 times the sum Eliezer Kaplan had mentioned, twice the figure set by David Ben-Gurion, and 3 times the entire oil revenues of Saudi Arabia for 1947. So basically, Ben-Gurion told her, I need you to raise at least this much for a war. She raised double it. Just a phenomenal success. And Ben-Gurion told her, he says, the day when history is written, it will be recorded that it was thanks to a Jewish woman that the Jewish state was born. So Ben-Gurion, he pretty much told all his people, he had people going all over the world trying to buy guns and stuff for a state that did not exist yet, which is legally very, very difficult to do. Pretty much said, whatever you can get, don't worry about money. She pretty much took care of it single-handedly. Now, Britain, this is just frustrating to read, but Britain wanted the Arabs to win. They really did, and they did as many things they could as to make that possible, even having British generals leading Arab armies. There's a couple of examples. Most of these are taken from this book called O Jerusalem, which chronicles a time from the UN vote through the war. It says the British government had agreed officially to give the Transjordanians enough ammunition to fight a 30-day war. Unofficially, the Legion had also been able to get a good deal more. For the past 6 weeks, the British had been nightly dumping their spare ammunition into the Dead Sea. Thanks to Glubb's contacts, Glubb, they called him Glubb Pasha because he was so fluent with the Bedouins and their language. He was actually a British general, or I don't know if he was a general, but a British official. So thanks to this British official's contacts, much of it instead had been dumped into the waiting trucks of his legionnaires. So they're supposed to be disposing of this ammo, and now it's going to the Arabs. Like I mentioned, this Arab Legion, which was the Arab armies of Transjordan, they were trained by Britain, but they were also led by British officials. And this is kind of frustrating too. So since May 14th, so since the beginning of the war, the United States had been seeking to get a ceasefire call through the Security Council. So little preview, May 14th starts a war between Israel and the Arabs. And from that point, the United States is trying to get pretty much stop fighting. But the American efforts had been persistently thwarted by Great Britain. Persuaded that the Arabs might be on the threshold of substantial gains, the British showed no disposition to hasten the end of the fighting. And the examples just go on and on and on. It's, like I said, it's pretty frustrating. But we should be able to cover this, and we'll probably stop after we do this. But this is incredible. So if you all, let's actually open our Bibles now. Long overdue to do that. To Ezekiel 4, we're going to read verses 3 through 6. It's Ezekiel 4, verses 3 through 6. This is God talking to Ezekiel. It says, Moreover, take thou unto thee an iron pan, and set it for a wall of iron between thee and the city. and set thy face against it, and it shall be besieged. For thou shalt lay siege against it. This shall be a sign to the house of Israel. And here's where we need to pay attention here. Lie thou also upon thy left side, and lay the iniquity of the house of Israel upon it. According to the number of the days that thou shalt lie upon it, thou shalt bear their iniquity. For I have laid upon thee the years of their iniquity, according to the number of the days, 390 days. So shalt thou bear the iniquity of the house of Israel. And when thou hast accomplished them, lie again on thy right side, and thou shalt bear the iniquity of the house of Judah 40 days. I have appointed thee each day for a year. So we have iniquity for Israel and Judah. There's 390 days for Israel, 40 days for Judah. As it says here, I've appointed you each day for a year. Now, there's a lot of different thoughts on, are there 10 lost tribes? There's actually a lot of evidence that says no, there's not. A lot of those of Israel actually able to come down into Jerusalem. So, again, there's debate here. But either way, I think what we need to do here for a total, if we want to know the total time period of iniquity for Judah and Israel, we combine to get 430 years. So, now it doesn't explicitly say this yet, but if you have 430 days of iniquity, what happens at the end of that? It's kind of implied that the Lord lifts his hand from him. He's going to punish them that long, and after that, the punishment's going to end. So, what is the start of this period? Well, I think we got to start with 606 BC, because this is when Israel, they lose their independence to Babylon. So this is the first clear-cut thing that we can say this is a starting point of iniquity. And it lines up with what Ezekiel's saying here, timeline-wise, also. But if you look up at Jeremiah 25, verse 11, we know that they were in Babylon, how long? I have it on the board, 70 years. So if we have a starting point, 606 BC, and we have 430 years starting from that, after the 70 years captivity, that brings us to 536 BC. So, we have to subtract that there. And they did. After 70 years, they came back. So, what happens if we follow this? So, 536, if we want to finish out this time of iniquity, we just continue down the line, 360 years. That brings us to 176 BC. Nothing of any importance whatsoever happened in 176 BC. The land was still under foreign powers. The Seleucids had it. So what does this mean? Did the prophecy just fall flat? Are we reading it wrong? What is happening here? Well, this blows at least my mind. Excuse me. I knew it was going to happen at one point. Turn over to Leviticus 26. And this is incredible because we see how interconnected God's word is. So we have a principle in Leviticus 26 that gives us the solution to this. So we're going to skip around a couple different verses. It says it so frequently that you will get the point for sure. So Leviticus 26, we're going to read verses 18, 21, 24, and 28. Leviticus 26, verse 18 says, "And if you will not yet for all this hearken unto me, then I will punish you 7 times more for your sins." Down to 21. "And if you will walk contrary unto me, and will not hearken unto me, I will bring 7 times more plagues upon you according to your sins." 24, same thing. "Then will I also walk contrary to you, and will punish you yet 7 times for your sins." Excuse me. Finally, 28. "Then I will walk contrary to you, yea, also in fury, and I, even I, will chastise you 7 times for your sins." So what this says is, if you kind of read all of Leviticus 26, it kind of grows with their sin. So they start to fall away. God says, I'm going to do this, and if you don't repent, I'm going to multiply it by this. And if you don't repent after that, I'm going to multiply it by this. So that's exactly what happened with when they came back from Babylon. God brought them back from Babylon, but they didn't just start rebuilding. They didn't remain righteous. So, what we have to do, we'll start from the beginning here, and we'll factor in this principle. Because again, when they came out of Babylon after 70 years, they were not righteous. As it says so many times in here, they walked contrary to God. So we start in 606 BC. Again, they had just 70 years captivity, so we're in 536 BC now. So after that, there's 360 of the 430 years remaining. But again, they did not repent. So according to this principle, God's going to multiply this by 7. So 360 years left. We multiply that by 7. Now there's 2,520 years of iniquity, which is an awful, awful lot. But again, he told them long before in the book of Leviticus, this is what will happen if you don't repent when I chastise you. So, especially with this many years, we have to convert from the Hebrew calendar to our calendar. Because the Hebrew calendar, there's 360 days in a year. We have 365.25. So we're just going to do some simple conversion here. So, this is 2,520 years. We want to know how many days it is. So we're just going to go to how many days, and then we'll convert that to our years. 360 days in the Hebrew calendar. So we have 907,200 days. Now to get to the Gregorian years, we divide that by how many days are in our year, 365.25. So now, in our terms, our calendar terms, there's 2,483.78 years of judgment remaining. So all we have to do is we start back. Now we know, starting from 536 BC, we have to go 2,483 years into the future. And you'll never guess what you come to if you punch this in. Now, just because there's no year 0, we have to add an additional year. And that's the year we come up with. The end of their iniquity. 1948 AD. And if you don't believe me, this is a calculator here. I just wanted to know how many years were between 536 BC and 1948. And there's 2,483 years, which is exactly what we converted to. This is not unbelievable. I mean, this is, I don't see how anybody could possibly refute this. I mean, these things were written so long ago. I mean, 1948 is relatively recent in historical terms. And here we have, back in the book of Ezekiel and back with the principle in Leviticus, the exact date for the year of Israel's, the end of their iniquity. Now, when I was given this, somebody asked, like, well, with a 0.78, when does that come in? I was like, well, and it actually might even get it down to the day. The problem is, when I think of 0.78, I was like, okay, you start in January, you go to December, what's 0.78 in there? But you'd have to know what month did Israel start in captivity, and then you'd have to start from there. And I haven't done all that, so maybe it works out to the exact date with this. Either way, I mean, this is phenomenal. Even if this was 1 or 2 years off, it'd still be like, but it's exactly. Brings us to the right year. Isaiah 66. Let's flip this up too. I don't know if I have it up here. Isaiah 66, verses 7 and 8. Now, I'm sure when we read this, if you're not familiar with the placement, you'll know it by what we read here, because we talk about it a lot. Where am I going? Isaiah. That's where I'm going. Isaiah 66, verses 7 and 8. Before she travailed, she brought forth. Before her pain came, she was delivered of a man-child. Who hath heard of such a thing? Who hath seen such things? Shall the earth be made forth to bring forth in one day? Or shall a nation be born at once? For as soon as Zion travailed, she brought forth her children. So what we learn from this is whatever is going to happen with the rebirth is going to be very quick. And we had mentioned that the mandate for Britain, it was going to end on May 14th, 1948. That is the same exact day that Israel, the state of Israel, was declared. I think the mandate technically was going to end at midnight. But with the Sabbath setting in, and the Jews knowing that many observing Jews would not be able to participate, they started it at 4 p.m. Because once 5 p.m. set in, the Sabbath started. So they started at 4 p.m. on May 14th, and David Ben-Gurion declared the state of Israel. And it was only a 30-minute thing. I mean, this is absolutely momentous occasion. It just took 30 minutes to get through. But I mean, you can see here in this newspaper, State of Israel is born on the same exact day the United States recognized the Jewish state. And this is what made it valid. I mean, there are people out there who, for example, the Palestinians are a perfect example. We have a state of Palestine. Problem is, no real nation actually acknowledges that state, so it doesn't really make any difference. The U.S. recognized it at 6:11 p.m. So this was 10 minutes after the. I'm trying to think exactly. Either way, the state was supposed to be born at 6 p.m. 10 minutes later, the U.S. recognized it.
In Tel Aviv, it was 4 o'clock in the afternoon on Friday, 1 hour before the Sabbath.
זוהי זכותו הטבעית של העם היהודי להיות ככל עם ועם עומד ברשות עצמו במדינתו הריבונית אשר תפתח לרווחה את שערי המולדת לכל יהודי ותעניק לעם היהודי מעמד של אומה שוות זכויות בתוך העמים. בתוקף זכותנו הטבעית וההיסטורית ועל יסוד החלטת עצרת האומות המאוחדות אנו מכריזים בזאת על הקמת מדינה יהודית בארץ ישראל, היא מדינת ישראל.
In the midst of diplomacy at the UN and the rumbling of imminent war in the Near East, the fate of the Jewish nation now lies in the hands of President Truman. United States recognition of the State of Israel is the Jewish nation's only hope for independence.
At 11 minutes past 6, Ambassador Philip Jessup of the United States delegation rose to the rostrum.
This government has been informed that a Jewish state has been proclaimed in Palestine, and recognition has been requested by the provisional government thereof. The United States recognizes the provisional government as the de facto authority of the new state of Israel.
Jewish exile had ended, but at 5 o'clock in the morning, Tel Aviv was bombed by Egyptian aircraft. Israel's defenders had no illusions about the perils that they would face. Israel knew the fear of death and the taste of birth in the same moment.
So like I said, 5 o'clock the next morning, Tel Aviv was bombed. I mean, if you read what Ben-Gurion's position on this, he said the whole time he's giving the speech declaring the state of Israel, I felt no joy in my heart whatsoever. The only thing I could think of is we are going to war. But and the time thing, at 6:11 p.m., I don't know if this is, if there's just different time zones, and that this was declared 10 minutes after Israel declared itself a state. I need to figure that out because it seems kind of odd here. But either way, 10 minutes after some important time, the nation of Israel was recognized by the U.S. and therefore made a valid nation. So therefore, the nation was born in 10 minutes. And that's why I think Isaiah 66 here, as soon as she travailed, she brought forth children. We'll finish with this, because we'll be at a good stopping point. But in Micah 5, verses 3 and 4, I mean, with the things we just learned about, look at this in context. Therefore will he give them up. And that makes you think of this time of iniquity when they were in exile. God gave them up to the Gentile nations. Therefore will he give them up until the time that she which travaileth hath brought forth. For then the remnant of his brethren shall return unto the children of Israel, and he shall stand and feed in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God, and they shall abide. For now shall he be great unto the ends of the earth. I mean, she was travailed. Obviously, this is the rebirth. So God will give them up until the rebirth. And that's exactly falls in line with this concept of the iniquity. And as soon as that ends, God would bless them again. So, but the only part of this that I would say needs to be fulfilled still is verses 4. That Israel feeds in the strength, or stands and feeds in the strength of the Lord. And I guess you can make a case that they have been blessed, obviously, since then. So perhaps in a sense they have. But certainly, now shall he be great unto the ends of the earth. That has not been completely finished yet. And you can look up those other verses, Isaiah 17, verses 21 to 23. This talks about the cup of iniquity that God gave Israel is taken out of their hand and given to their oppressors. That aligns up with this, and we'll end on Amos 9, verses 14 and 15. I think this is a super important verse. When we think of what's going to happen with Israel in the future, are they going to go into captivity again? All these different things. Amos 9, verses 14 and 15. And I will bring again the captivity of my people of Israel, which means, the Jews, they are the captivity. So he says, I'm going to bring their captivity again. He's going to bring them back to Israel. And that's evidenced by the next verses. And they shall build the waste cities and inhabit them. And they shall plant vineyards and drink the wine thereof. They shall also make gardens and eat the fruit of them. And I will plant them upon their land, and they shall no more be pulled up out of their land, which I have given them, saith the Lord thy God. God has regathered them, he has planted them, and he will not pluck them up again. So with that, we will now turn our attention to the emblems. It would be, in a way, it would be nice to have a prophecy that gives us the exact year of Christ's return, just like it gave us of Israel's rebirth, but it also, for obvious reasons, and I think very wise reasons, we're not given that. We are to always be watching and waiting, but we have been given all of these signs. The things we're talking about right now are huge, huge markers on the divine timetable that tell us how close we are to Christ's return. And every single one of those indicators tells us that we are on the very, very cusp. And so, because when you read most of these passages, like that one we just read in Micah 5, it talks about Israel being reborn and then being brought back. And then the next verse is there, verse 4. I would say this is kingdom age kind of talk here. They're great to the ends of the earth. This is when the kingdom of Israel under Christ conquers the entire earth. If you were just reading this, you would never guess that there was 75 years of time between the rebirth and Israel being great to the ends of the earth. But yet, there we are. We're right between the verse 3 and 4. So this is the next thing to happen. And when you look like Ezekiel 37, the valley of dry bones, it talks about these dry bones being, resurrected essentially. And then right after that, it talks about Christ being there, David reigning. So all these prophecies show this as the next big thing. And again, we never would have guessed that there's 75 years. But I think that's where, if we're thinking of this correctly, this generation shall not pass away until all these things be fulfilled. whether that's 70 years or 80 years by strength, as the passage says, but Israel's 75 now. So we're very fast approaching that, if we are understanding the generation correctly. But the point being, there's not a single logical, valid, or even sensible reason for us to say, Christ is a long way off. By all accounts, he could have come a long time ago, and he could come even this very moment.